When I arrived as a graduate student at Emory's philosophy department in 1994, I met Bob in my first semester. I was a student in his class on consciousness. I was immediately struck by his breadth of knowledge, his compassion for students, and his intellectual honesty. He went on to become not only my mentor, but also my friend. I've often thought of Bob as a surrogate parent. Some of you may know that the scientific literature on parenting identifies two principal factors that promote positive outcomes in children, namely high warmth and high expectations. Anyone who knows Bob knows that this describes his rare combination of humanism and hyper-conscientiousness. I sometimes imagine what my life would have been like had I never met him. They are not happy imaginings, but they're ones that make me grateful. Grateful for his interest in my academic development, grateful for how he modeled intellectual virtues, and grateful for making me a better thinker and a better person. Long after I left Emory, I went on to become a clinical psychologist. I now spend half my week seeing patients and the other half teaching and writing. This talk is situated at a three-way intersection between philosophy, scientific research, and clinical practice. The talk is divided into 5 parts. The first involves a few preliminaries related to explanatory and interpretive theories. Here I propose a number of conceptualizations for the purpose of clarifying what I hope to express. The conceptualizations are minimalistic and therefore permissive. While some may find their permissiveness objectionable, I've chosen this approach in the hope of forestalling disagreements about the details of concepts that can be formulated in a variety of ways with the same ultimate force and effect on the theses I use them to advocate. That aside, I conceptualize theories as representations of recurrent relations between phenomena. The relevant contrast class to theory is history, which I conceptualize as representations of non-recurrent relations between phenomena. This is, of course, not the only possible contrast class for theory. Theory is often contrasted with empirical or experimental activity, as it is in theoretical physics. Theory is sometimes contrasted with known fact, as it is in the theory of the multiverse. And in the philosophy of science, theories are frequently contrasted with models, though I am using the term theory in a permissive sense intended to include scientific modeling. I recognize that models represent differently than theories, but the differences have little relevance for what I will propose today. I conceptualize explanations as representations that produce understanding of objective relations between phenomena. The relevant contrast class to explanation is interpretation, which I conceptualize as representations that produce understanding of the subjective meanings of phenomena. Both explanations and interpretations produce understanding, but of different things and in different ways. Explanations produce understanding of relations like causation, composition, realization, transition, and many others. I refer to such relations as objective, not because our knowledge of them is objective. It is not. In my view, knowledge is decidedly subjective, since knowledge is a characteristic of minds. I refer to relations like causation as objective because we tend to assume, at least in science, that such relations exist, whether we know about them or not. The world does not disappear when we close our eyes. While explanations are representations of objective relations, interpretations are representations of subjective meanings. Not long ago, the paradigmatic example of a phenomenon with meaning was natural language. But as McCauley observes in a recent paper, what counts as meaningful has expanded to include a huge range of phenomena. He writes, not only are language and its use capable of carrying meaning, so are events, times, places, substances, actions, interactions, personal relationships, organizations, institutions, social arrangements, artifacts, psychological states, and processes, to note but some of the most prominent candidates. At the head of that list, though, are an individual's experiences. I agree that the meaning of meaning has expanded dramatically in recent years, and while I share Bob's concern for the muddle it has created, I suspect the new arrangement is here to stay. I will add that Bob's observation that experiences are at the head of the list of phenomena that carry meaning quite aptly characterizes a great deal of what goes on in clinical practice, namely psychotherapy, but more on that later. When you combine the previously mentioned conceptualization of explanation with that of theory, you get explanatory theories, which are representations that produce understanding of recurrent objective relations between phenomena. Explanatory theories are everywhere in science, and although their role in scientific activity is sometimes debated, most take their importance for granted. The same cannot be said of interpretive theories, which are representations that produce understanding of recurrent subjective meanings of phenomena. Meanings, it may be argued, are idiomatic and therefore not amenable to general theories. In opposition to this view, McCauley has contended that general interpretive theories are both achievable and valuable. I share the same belief, as well as his declaration made 30 years ago together with Tom Lawson, that the processes of interpretation and explanation are interrelated and necessary steps in understanding the world and our place in it. In this talk, I set out to apply that perspective to work in clinical practice, focusing primarily on mood variation, which is a particular interest of mine, and secondarily to religious coping, as religious phenomena are a common interest of many gathered here. My first thesis, then, is that explanatory and interpretive theories contribute to one another in clinical practice. I will say no more about this thesis now, but rather return to it in the final section. In this second part, I'd like to trot out some assumptions that underlie my understanding of the origins of human similarities and differences. None of this work is mine, and most or all of it will be familiar to most or all of you. Assumption 1. Biological and cultural evolution interact to produce complementary biological and cultural adaptations. This is the central postulate of dual inheritance theory, popularized by Robert Boyd and Peter Richardson, among others. Examples like lactase persistence resulting from dairy farming and anatomical changes resulting from food processing are no doubt familiar to all, so need no recitation here. Suffice to say that I agree with the now widespread view that evolutionary processes occur in both biological and cultural phenomena. Evolutionary processes appear to occur whenever a system has the following three conditions: variation, selection, and transmission. What is varied may be the phenotypes of organisms or the phenotypes of arrowheads. What is selected may be biologically fit individuals or prestigious cultural luminaries. What is transmitted may be the genes of progenitors or the memes of TikTok users. Under conditions of variation, selection, and transmission, evolutionary processes tend to produce adaptations. I conceptualize biological adaptations as biological traits that were produced by selection processes and that produce fitness benefits for organisms. Camouflage is an exemplar of biological adaptation. The selection processes that produce biological adaptations minimally include natural selection, sexual selection, and kin selection, and arguably include other processes like group selection. I conceptualize cultural adaptations as cultural traits that were produced by selection processes and that produce fitness benefits for organisms. The javelin is an exemplar of cultural adaptation. The selection processes that produce cultural adaptations include the content biases popularized by Dan Sperber, Pascal Boyer, and others, as well as the context biases popularized by Joe Henrich and others. Assumption 2. Humans have instincts. By instinct, I mean to refer to an evolved disposition toward a mental process or behavior that was adaptive in ancestral environments. I recognize that the term instinct has been unpopular for most of the past century. There have been some notable defenders of the term, including John Tooby and Lita Cosmides, Steven Pinker, and a handful of others. Instincts are generally thought of as innate traits, which has been an endless source of strife between empiricists and nativists. Conceptualizing innateness as inborn probably won't work, since recent science suggests that infants learn a variety of things before birth. Conceptualizing innateness as before learning is also questionable because, as Chomsky pointed out, it's not clear whether some human capacity should be described as learning or growing, and certainly nothing happens to organisms before growing. Instincts are sometimes thought to be the opposite of learning, though defenders of the term point out that many human instincts are learning capacities, and therefore more domains of learning requires more instincts, not less. Instincts are sometimes criticized for being non-explanatory, since designating a mental process or a behavior an instinct does nothing to explain how it works or how it got there. This criticism I agree with. To call something an instinct is to identify an explanandum, something to be explained, not to furbish an explanans, something that does the explaining. Even with all this baggage, I think the term is worth saving, though I do not have time here to do much more on its behalf. Bob has coined the term maturationally natural capacities to refer to human capacities that reliably develop in most humans regardless of the cultural setting. Maturationally natural capacities have the following characteristics. With some exceptions, they develop early, they are tuned by culture, they're not explicitly taught, they're part of normal development, they're domain-specific, their operation is mandatory, and their operation is unconscious. I'd like to point out that the first four characteristics of maturationally natural capacities all relate to human development, which brings me to assumption 3. The expression of human instincts is mediated by developmental contingencies. Humans share the instinct of disgust, but different human groups experience disgust at different foods. Humans share the instinct of play, but different human groups have different norms regarding the do's and don'ts of play. Humans share the instinct of sexual desire, but different human groups have different norms regarding the appropriate expression of sexual desire. All of these group differences involve learning, and learning is contingent upon what the environment affords, both materially and socially. The learning that takes place during human development adapts individuals to local environmental conditions. To express this, I propose a notion of developmental adaptations, which I conceptualize as traits that were produced by developmental selection processes and that produce fitness benefits for organisms. By developmental selection processes, I mean to include instincts such as imitation, the content and context biases that produce cultural traits, and associative learning. While the psychobiological mechanisms that underlie these various processes undoubtedly differ in their details, in each case the organism is selective, whether it selectively attends, selectively learns, selectively recalls, or selectively acts. Selection need not be reflective or conscious. In fact, it is usually intuitive and unconscious. The operation of developmental selection processes in combination with local environmental conditions produces developmental adaptations, which may be thought of as tuned instincts. In other words, instincts are the dispositions of organisms that are present before substantial learning and acculturation, whereas developmental adaptations are the capacities that are present after it. Learning a language is an instinct, speaking Mandarin is a developmental adaptation. Other potential developmental selection processes are suggested by life history theories, proposed by Stephen Stearns and others. The common hypothesis in life history theory is that early environmental inputs initiate phenotypic trajectories that canalize over time. While still controversial, life history theory has been used to help account for variation in biological traits such as rate of maturation, as well as psychological traits such as personality. One last example of a developmental selection process is provided by attachment theory, provided by John Bowlby, which identifies recurring patterns of cognition and behavior relating to attachment, separation, reunion, and loss. A large body of psychological research suggests that early developmental attachment style persists into adulthood, influencing social cognition and behavior across the lifespan. The combination of these and other developmental selection processes turns the potentiality of the individual into their actuality. Developmental selection shapes the inner world and makes behavior recognizably human. In this third part, I offer a small contribution to recent evolutionary research on mood. The bulk of research on mood in psychiatry and clinical psychology focuses on the proximate causes of pathological mood variation, that is to say, mood disorders. In contrast, much of the evolutionary research on mood focuses on the ultimate causes of ordinary mood variation. In other words, why does mood variability exist in our species, and perhaps other species as well? It is tempting to think that mood variability is just a disturbance to homeostasis, the regulatory mechanisms that maintain a stable internal environment. As such, mood variability may seem like a bug, a dysfunction in human design. Bruce McEwen, Peter Sterling, and others have criticized the homeostatic model of human physiology, now some 130 years old, as outdated and misleading. The goal of physiological regulation is not to preserve constancy in the internal milieu. It is to continually adjust it to meet the changing needs of the organisms, a set of mechanisms they refer to as allostasis. Blood pressure, for example, must be increased or decreased to meet the demands of an organism's obligate activities, which vary from foraging to fighting to sleeping. Optimal regulation under such varying conditions is not a state of constancy. I want to propose that the same thing is true of mood. Mood is designed to vary. Variability is not a bug, it is a feature. Or put differently, mood variability is an instinct. That is to say, it is an evolved disposition toward mental processes and behaviors that were adaptive in ancestral environments. To say that mood variability is an instinct does nothing to explain it. Rather, it identifies it as something that needs to be explained. To do that, I suggest that the standard unidimensional conceptualization of mood as a dipolar continuum ranging from mood elevation to depression is too impoverished to stimulate much explanatory theorizing. Instead, I propose a multidimensional conceptualization of mood elevation and depression that parameterizes mood variability in terms of features of cognition, emotion, motivation, inhibition, and physiological regulation. First, the cognitive outlook of people with depressed mood tends to be pessimistic, whereas the cognitive outlook of people with elevated mood tends to be optimistic. This truism can be gleaned from ordinary life, but is also corroborated by a large body of empirical research on depression, demonstrating that clinically depressed people selectively perceive, learn, remember, and predict negative information and events. Show an array of faces to people with depression, they will pick out the sad ones. Ask people with depression to recall childhood memories, they will recall the unhappy ones. Ask people with depression whether a beanbag chair is a chair, to them, it is not. People with elevated mood, in contrast, often become unreasonably optimistic. As reflected in the cognition checklist for mania, people with clinically significant mood elevations tend to endorse items like, everything I do is great, and everyone loves me. I know of one bipolar patient who quit a successful career to devote decades of his life to a perpetual motion machine. This is unreasonable optimism. The foregoing discussion is framed in terms of pathological mood variability, in other words, mood disorders, but that's only because that's where most of the research lies. The dimensions I include in this framework are intended to characterize both pathological and ordinary mood variation. Second, the emotional tone of people with depressed mood tends to be dysphoric, whereas the emotional tone of people with elevated mood tends to be euphoric. Again, this obvious observation is corroborated by a large body of empirical research demonstrating that people with major depression experience more negative emotion than people without it. A smaller body of empirical research into mania suggests that manic people experience more positive emotion even when they experience greater irritability. Third, the motivational drive of people with depressed mood tends to be depleted, whereas the motivational drive of people with elevated mood tends to be expansive. Much empirical research corroborates this, as does clinical practice. Affective neuroscience has provided an increasingly detailed picture of the neural underpinnings of motivational variation. Many functional neuroimaging studies have related motivational variation to differences in the activity of the brain's dopaminergic system, especially the mesolimbic and mesocortical pathways. At the risk of great oversimplification, people who are motivationally depleted have hypoactive dopaminergic activity, whereas people who are motivationally expansive have hyperactive dopaminergic activity. Fourth, people with depressed mood tend to be highly inhibited, whereas people with elevated mood tend to be disinhibited. In depression, inhibition is expressed by decreased goal-directed behavior, decreased social behavior, and indecisiveness. A consistent finding in affective neuroscience is that the amygdala, a key neural correlate in threat detection, is hyperactive in people with depression, which may account for their increased inhibition. In mania, disinhibition is expressed by increased goal-directed behavior, increased impulsivity, and increased talkativeness. Disinhibition associated with mania may be attributable to frontal lobe dysfunction, though the neuromechanisms of manic disinhibition are less well understood. Fifth, people with depressed mood tend to be physiologically downregulated, including decreased energy, decreased activity, and decreased sexual interest. People with elevated mood tend to be physiologically upregulated, including increased energy, increased activity, and increased sexual interest. With this framework in mind, I return to the question of why mood variability exists. Here is the answer I propose. In ancestral environments, mood variability helped humans modulate their cognitive, emotional, motivational, inhibitory, and physiological parameters to help optimize fitness under varying environmental conditions. Favorable environmental conditions tend to induce elevated mood. In other words, optimism, euphoria, expansiveness, disinhibition, and physiological upregulation, helping humans capitalize under advantageous ecological or social conditions. On the other hand, unfavorable environmental conditions tend to induce depressed mood. In other words, pessimism, dysphoria, depletion, inhibition, and physiological downregulation, helping humans hunker down under disadvantageous ecological or social conditions. This thesis expands on the views of a number of evolutionary researchers. I will mention just a few. Randy Nesse, who may be unfamiliar to some of you, is a professor of life sciences at Arizona State. For several decades, he's advanced the theory that depression is an adaptation that helps humans and other animals survive unfavorable conditions. The idea was inspired in part by optimal foraging theory in ecology, which models how animals make foraging decisions in patchy environments. To make good decisions, animals must track the ratio of productivity to expenditure. When the ratio is high, it's time to get while the getting is good. When the ratio is low, it's time to move on to another patch. Animals are remarkably adept at making foraging decisions, including the decision to temporarily halt all foraging and wait until environmental conditions improve. The most obvious example of this is winter hibernation. Depression is reminiscent of hibernation, and the resemblance may be no accident. People get depressed for all kinds of reasons, but one of the more common is when their efforts to achieve valued goals are frustrated or fail altogether. Nesse has argued that depression is an adaptation that protects us from wasting our efforts on futile enterprises by getting us to de-invest from them. This view suggests two complementary hypotheses relating mood variation to goal achievement. The first is that elevated mood positively correlates with progress and success at achieving adaptive goals. The second is that depressed mood positively correlates with frustration and failure to achieve adaptive goals. Evidence for these hypotheses can be found in clinical studies with psychiatric populations, which show that people with recent failures relating to important life goals have elevated rates of depression. Conversely, people with bipolar disorder appear to be at risk of elevated mood or mania following goal achievement. Evidence of a causal relationship between mood and goal achievement is provided by psychological experiments that manipulate task success or failure to induce positive or negative mood states in non-psychiatric populations. And in affective neuroscience, goal pursuit and achievement have been linked to the incentive and consummatory functions of the brain's reward system. A second adaptationist theory related to depression was proposed by John Price, a psychiatrist and former medical researcher at Newcastle University. Termed the involuntary defeat strategy, the theory suggests that depression is an adaptation designed to protect a social animal from serious injury or death when it has lost a dominance dispute with a conspecific in its social group. The symptoms of depression, such as motivational depletion, behavioral inhibition, and physiological downregulation, serve to prevent the defeated animal from further challenge to rivals, thereby protecting the animal from a fate worse than defeat. This theory also suggests two complementary hypotheses relating mood variation to change in social rank. The first is that elevated mood positively correlates with gains in social rank within a group. The second is that depressed mood positively correlates with losses in social rank within a group. Some psychological studies show a significant relationship between perceived inferiority and higher rates of depression. Many epidemiological studies link lower socioeconomic status to higher rates of depression. And behavioral biologists like Robert Sapolsky have popularized the understanding that animals at the bottom of status hierarchies are the ones who are the most stressed and the most depressed. Two corollaries follow from the above discussion. The first is that mood variation is normal when it tracks environmental variation, and when it tracks environmental variation and it does not exceed adaptive limits. The second is that mood variation is pathological when it fails to track environmental variation or when it exceeds adaptive limits. People who experience optimism, euphoria, expansiveness, disinhibition, and physiological upregulation in the face of unfavorable circumstances may seem improbable, but anyone who has worked with bipolar patients is familiar with it. Many manic patients are euphoric, even in the face of disastrous life circumstances. Conversely, people who experience pessimism, dysphoria, depletion, inhibition, and physiological downregulation in the face of favorable circumstances are probably more familiar to non-clinicians. They can be seen on wealthy college campuses all across North America. Even when mood variation tracks environmental variation, it sometimes falls outside an adaptive range. When this is the case, people become severely elevated or severely depressed. Severely elevated patients are reckless, posing a risk to themselves and others. Many become psychotic. Severely depressed patients become hopeless and suicidal. Although less well known, they can also become psychotic. In the years I worked at a psychiatric hospital, I saw many patients with severe mood variations that left them profoundly impaired. That said, when mood variation tracks environmental variation and when adapted limits are not exceeded, I do not view mood elevation or depression as pathological or disordered. On the contrary, I believe it is the proper functioning of an evolved disposition, that is to say, an instinct. In my view, many less acute patients are in fact depressed, but do not have a depressive disorder. This is far from received wisdom. There is no agreed upon distinction between depression and depressive disorders in medicine or in clinical psychology, and some would argue that such a distinction is meaningless. That, in my view, is because medical doctors and clinical psychologists typically receive little or no education in evolution. In this next part, I offer a few words about religious coping, mood moderation, and credibility-enhancing displays. Here I will be somewhat brief because, while I'm an interested observer, I have no special expertise in the cognitive science of religion. Nevertheless, I'd like to say a few words drawn from the clinical literature and from my clinical experience. My thesis here is that positive religious coping helps the management of mood disorders. This thesis suggests another set of hypotheses. The first is that positive religious coping moderates depressed mood. The second is that positive religious coping moderates high-risk behaviors in people with mania. There is considerable empirical evidence for the first hypothesis. At this point, the majority of studies that have examined the relationship between depression and religious coping have found that positive religious coping reduces the severity of unipolar depression, as well as the depressive episodes of people with bipolar disorder. Some here may be familiar with the R-COPE, which is a validated measure that differentiates positive religious coping from negative religious coping. Positive religious coping involves benevolent religious reappraisals of psychiatric symptoms, such as, my situation is part of God's plan. Negative religious coping involves malevolent religious reappraisals, such as God is punishing me or my situation is caused by the devil. Positive religious coping involves collaboration with others, such as increased church attendance or charitable work. Negative religious coping involves estrangement from others, such as blaming clergy or other parishioners for lack of support. In short, good evidence exists that positive religious coping reduces depression and that negative religious coping frequently exacerbates it. By comparison to depression, very few studies of the relationship between bipolar disorder and religious coping have been conducted. Among the most cited is a prospective study from Brazil that found that bipolar people with positive religious coping tend to have better quality of life when measuring physical, mental, social, and environmental factors. Notably, the same study found that negative religious coping placed bipolar patients at higher risk for manic episodes. As for the hypothesis that positive religious coping moderates high-risk behaviors in people with mania, I could find no direct empirical evidence. A variety of studies have examined the high-risk behaviors of people with mania, but none of them also examine religious coping. In the absence of empirical evidence, I'll offer a clinical observation. People who are manic frequently spend money they do not have, use substances to excess, act impulsively in ways that put them at risk, and have sexual activities they later regret. It is a well-known clinical phenomenon that religious bipolar patients often become hyper-religious during manic episodes, leading to increased prayer, increased religious ritual attendance, and increased religious cognition. On several occasions, I've treated religious patients who successfully managed their manic episodes by directing their increased goal-directed activity into religiously sanctioned behavior, rather than to the high-risk behaviors that so frequently result from mania. From this, I hypothesize that positive religious coping moderates high-risk behaviors in people with mania. Whether this hypothesis will be supported by future evidence is an open question. While I'm in a speculative mood, I will offer two conjectures related to religious coping and credibility-enhancing displays, that is, costly behaviors that promote belief transmission described by Joe Henrich and others. The first conjecture is that negative religious coping with depressed mood contributes to a common religious cred, namely penance. Penance is a common element of a number of religious traditions, and some penance is quite costly. On multiple occasions, I've observed increased acts of penance in depressed patients who rely on negative religious coping. For example, I treated a depressed patient at a psychiatric hospital who started every therapy session reading from a journal in which she recorded her sins and the associated acts of penance, some of which were highly onerous. The second conjecture is that positive religious coping with elevated mood contributes to another common religious cred, namely proselytizing. I treated a bipolar patient at a community mental health clinic who would frequently refuse to take her Depakote, invariably resulting in a manic episode during which she would spend euphoric days at the beach proselytizing strangers, a rather costly display. Whether these clinical observations are generalizable is anyone's guess, and so I will leave them as conjectures. In this last part, I return to my original thesis, namely that explanatory and interpretive theories contribute to one another in clinical practice. To start with an obvious example, diagnosis is both an act of interpretation and an act of explanation. Clinicians must interpret the signs and symptoms observed or reported by patients. Resulting diagnoses help explain what the patient is experiencing, though admittedly a diagnosis is the beginning of an explanation, not the end of it. A diagnosis provides a starting point for therapy, which explores the factors contributing to a patient's psychiatric symptoms and life problems. Like diagnosis, therapy is both an explanatory and an interpretive endeavor. At times, the contents of therapy are demonstrably explanatory, such as when attributing a patient's recent decline in mood to a period of prolonged stress. At times, the contents of therapy are demonstrably interpretive, such as when exploring a patient's associations surrounding a childhood memory. Sometimes an act of interpretation is simultaneously an act of explanation. Admittedly, this can make the distinction between them elusive, as Karim Khalifa has argued. Nevertheless, I believe the distinction is worth preserving, and that the interaction of explanatory and interpretive acts contributes to beneficial outcomes for patients. In what remains of this talk, I'll mention a handful of examples of interactions between explanation and interpretation in clinical practice. 1. Basic emotions are instincts that provide information about adaptive problems. By basic emotions, I'm alluding to the work of Paul Ekman and others who focus on species-wide emotions with characteristic facial expressions. In my experience, the most common basic emotions that people present to therapy with are fear, sadness, and anger. Each of these emotions may usefully be interpreted in light of explanatory scientific theories. First, many people who come to therapy are initially fearful, which can often be interpreted in light of evolutionary theory. The evolved function of fear is, of course, to signal a perceived threat. Initial fear in therapy may signal the unknown threat of a stranger, that is the therapist, or it may signal the threat of disclosing sensitive information, which is often associated with status loss. Second, many patients report recurring sadness, which can often be interpreted in light of attachment theory. John Bowlby and others have suggested that sadness is a signal that a person has unmet needs, primarily but not exclusively needs related to affiliation and safety. Third, many patients report recurring anger, which often can be interpreted in light of explanatory theories and moral psychology. Jonathan Haidt and his colleagues have suggested that anger is a signal that someone has not taken your welfare into account by the standards of local fairness norms. Interpretations of basic emotions like this are, of course, conjectural. They are an example of abductive inference in which the effect is used to hypothesize about the cause. Like any hypothesis, they may be refuted by the consideration of the available evidence. That said, the foregoing is an example of how clinical interpretations based on explanatory scientific theories are valuable heuristics in clinical practice. 2. Depression is frequently the result of failure or defeat. Here I am invoking the adaptationist theories of people like Randy Nesse and John Price. An initially puzzling clinical phenomenon is that many people who are depressed have little or no idea why. This is another opportunity for explanatory scientific theories to lend a hand to clinical interpretation. When I ask depressed patients about their experiences of failure, I often learn that they have failed to achieve the kinds of adaptive goals that made our ancestors successful. They have few or low-quality friendships. They have high-conflict romantic relationships. They have work they find stressful or meaningless, or they lack a sense of purpose and progress in their lives. When I ask them about their experiences of defeat, I often learn that they have a history of involuntary subordination by parents, siblings, spouses, or others. Often they are the most agreeable person in a family of disagreeable people. When a patient is depressed but does not have a depressive disorder, I encourage them to interpret their depressive symptoms as being not like a seizure, but rather like a fever. Seizures have no adaptive function. Fevers, while unpleasant, do. If a patient's depression is functional, it is crucial to interpret what the possible functions could be. Otherwise, the treatment of depression amounts to treating a fever rather than the infection that is causing it. 3. Much of the mind is unconscious. This has been a consistent finding in cognitive science for several decades, as well as a central axiom of the depth psychology of Freud and his intellectual descendants for well over a century. Although they may have little else in common, both cognitive science and depth psychology describe behaviors whose proximate causes are largely unconscious, and mental processes whose operations are largely unavailable to introspection. While cognitive scientists devote their efforts to explaining how unconscious processes produce various human capacities, clinicians devote theirs to interpreting how unconscious processes produce various human incapacities. Clinicians frequently invite patients to consider that their behaviors may be motivated by factors beneath their awareness. They also invite patients to consider that the psychiatric symptoms they experience may be rooted in unconscious processes about which they have limited ability to introspect. Clinicians sometimes challenge patients' confabulations, proposing alternative interpretations of behavior that may be less experience near to the patient, but more consistent with explanatory theories in science. 4. Patients frequently have adaptations that are anachronistic. An anachronistic adaptation is one that was adaptive in an earlier environment, but fails to be adaptive in a later one. For example, many species of plants in the Americas produce large, fleshy fruits that until recently were worth the metabolic cost of production because the fauna that ate the fruits also distributed the seeds. But after the Holocene mass extinction of megafauna in the Americas, the plants were left with the cost of fruit production without the benefits of seed dispersal. Similarly, many plants evolved metabolically expensive defenses against herbivores that no longer exist. In this case, what is true of plants turns out to be true of people. Many people in treatment have adaptations that are anachronistic in two important respects. First, people have ancestral adaptations that are anachronistic. Like the rest of us, people in treatment are biologically adapted to more exercise, more sleep, more nature, more sunlight, and more social integration. Yet they lead lives that are sedentary, sleep-deprived, carpentered, artificially lighted, and lonely. Many minor mood disturbances can be treated by addressing these factors alone. Second, people in treatment often have developmental adaptations that are anachronistic. An anxious attachment to a parent may have contributed to increased parental investment in childhood, but it frequently causes problems in later adult relationships. Like the plants who make fruits for animals that no longer exist, the expenditures of an anxious attachment in adulthood are rarely worth the returns. Additionally, people develop psychological defenses in childhood and adolescence, such as denial, acting out, projection, splitting, and others. Defenses that may have been adaptive for surviving a turbulent family household, but that later cause problems to reality testing, emotion regulation, and relationships. Like plants that have defenses for animals that no longer exist, often the primitive defenses acquired during childhood are protecting us from nothing other than the specters of our past. The last interaction I will mention is something I've never shared with a patient, but given the interest of many in attendance here, I will share with you. And that is this: therapy is the enactment of a ritual. To begin with, the use of time in therapy is ritualized. It is customary to meet at regular intervals at the same time of day for the same length of time. Therapists are trained to faithfully adhere to this practice. Therapy often begins with ritualized phrases. The therapist asks, "How are you?" The words demarcate the moment therapy has begun. The moment therapy ends is also demarcated when the therapist says something like, "We have to stop for today." The use of space in therapy is also ritualized. Conventionally, each session takes place in the same room. The therapist sits in the same seat. Patients tend to do the same even when they have a choice. The objects in the room stay in the same place from week to week. If an object moves, patients usually notice, as though its placement had some special significance. In therapy, there are rules regarding asymmetrical provisioning of care. The therapist is there to care for the patient. Deviations from that arrangement are scrupulously avoided, with one exception. The patient must perform a ritual sacrifice in the form of paying the therapist. There are also rules regarding asymmetrical provisioning of therapeutic material. The patient provides the raw materials in the form of thoughts, emotions, and stories of past and present. The therapist is expected to process the raw materials provided by the patient and to do so with some special knowledge and understanding. The knowledge of the therapist, as well as their right to identify themselves by a particular title and to practice in a particular place, is ratified by a higher authority, a licensing board. When the ritual of therapy is successful, a coalition is built between the therapist and the patient, which is commonly referred to as the therapeutic alliance. Techniques are routinely employed to promote affiliation and cohesion, including interventions referred to as reflecting and mirroring. Most modern forms of therapy recognize the importance of the therapeutic role of emotion co-regulation, that is, using the nervous system of the therapist to help regulate the nervous system of the patient. All of these interventions build coalition and sometimes even fictive kinship between therapist and patient. Other commonalities between therapy and ritual suggest themselves. As with many rituals, therapy is low in sensory pageantry and participant arousal, and therefore must be repeated frequently to be memorable and effective. As with many rituals, therapy often invokes symbols, whether in the form of recurring metaphors, interpreted dreams, or meaningful mistakes. As with many rituals, therapists and patients rarely, if ever, touch each other, as though the therapist were a sacred object and the patient a source of contagion. Therapy could be compared to a healing ritual, where mental distress and impairment are repaired. It could be compared to a purification ritual, where negative emotions and destructive impulses are purged. Or it could be compared to a rite of passage, where people slough off the husks of their previous identities as they grow into another. Whatever comparisons to ritual I might drum up for the sake of conversation, I want to acknowledge that there are important limitations to the comparison. For example, it is not clear whether therapy could be categorized as either imagistic or doctrinal, to use Harvey Whitehouse's familiar distinction. This suggests to me that the ritualistic elements of therapy are vestigial in nature. But there is a more important limitation, and I will end with it. The therapist is not a priest, oracle, or shaman. They're not a special agent of the divine. They are merely a worldly caregiver. As such, their role is to be helpful and to be truthful. The therapist's truthfulness depends on their limited knowledge of the vast array of factors that explain human mental life and behavior. As a scientific naturalist, I view science as the preeminent producer of truth-approximating explanations of nature, including human nature. Because of this, I believe that even though therapists routinely rely on a kind of ritual to treat mental illness, they should abstain from encouraging patients to believe in magic. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I was really excited about your talk because I also do work on evolutionary theories of clinical problems or normative reactions to loss in grief. And so I'm really familiar with Nessa and others' work and think it should be integrated more into clinical therapy. I had two points. I'll ask one question and then I'll maybe hand it over to someone else. But the first was right at the start of your talk, where it was what I thought was notably lacking was something critical, and it's critical in our theory of the role of hypervigilance in grief and the function that it serves. And that's time. And whether something was adaptive or is currently adaptive or maladaptive or an adaptation, I think is critically dependent on time. And I don't mean time from a clinical perspective when, you have, for example, grief that's gone on too long, right? There's a normative period. I mean, from the perspective of evolutionary sciences, let me use an example. So in grief, you want to make sure, because you've invested in this relationship your whole life, that that person is gone. And as the scholar to my right here has rightly pointed out, there's no cognitive switch that flips. We don't have an innate way to distinguish between living and dead, right? We have cues. But over time, the kind of benefit of keeping a hypervigilant state to perceive cues for that person in the environment, there should be a tipping point, right, at which it's no longer adaptive. And so my question to you is, how and where does time, not from a clinical perspective of function, but from an evolutionary perspective, feed into your theory about treatment? Sorry, that was a really long question. Does the question make sense?
Not entirely.
Okay. So
I will say that I will just say before you reformulate in a way that I can digest, grief and depression are quite different clinical phenomena.
So I actually think that grief is something that we assume is a coherent cluster of phenomena. So we actually defractionate it and look at what is the role. So we're talking about time. Let's look at the role of depression. Depression in grief should come adaptively as a way to socially remove yourself from the environment, and especially in the case of unpredictable loss, to ruminate about the cause of the loss to prevent future losses. So depression should actually be more predominant after about the first 3 months, right? Like it peaks and it troughs, but we should find that it peaks cross-culturally at around 3 months, large and behold.
Depression or grief?
Depression. Yeah. Depression is part of the cluster.
That's what I disagree with.
Okay.
Because the phenomena are quite different. Like, for example, in depression, people typically have low self-esteem, but in grief, they do not.
So I say depression is periods of low mood and social withdrawal. And that component of grief cross-culturally does kick in more predominantly at around 3 months. Before then, you tend to have hypervigilance and yearning. People seek out. Neurobiological studies have shown that people get almost a neurobiological adrenaline rush, a euphoria from seeing images of the person. And so that's why I raised the point about time as being key.
Key to grief or key to depression?
Key to understanding whether or not something is adaptive or maladaptive from an evolutionary context.
Yeah, I don't think I can talk at length about grief, although, again, I'll reiterate that there's lots of characteristics that the one has that the other does not. Like, grief comes in waves, and depression typically does not come in waves.
Okay.
I have worked with people who have been depressed for 6 weeks, and I have worked with people who have been depressed for 40 years. And so if we're talking about the lifespan of the individual, to me, time is not the crucial factor. To me, the crucial factor is the relationship between the person and their environment, and can they achieve the adaptive goals that they have inherited, mostly biologically inherited as instincts. And so those adaptive goals were the adaptive goals of our ancestors: forming coalitions, finding mates and retaining them, perhaps having children, having meaningful work, having a sense of participating in something larger than yourself. None of those things, to me, are particularly dependent on the time factor, but I'm not denying that time is a factor. And in grief, it most certainly is a factor. Particularly because there is a normative period during which people grieve. It varies cross-culturally, of course, but when people are grieving, I've worked with people with complicated bereavement who are grieving a loss from 7, 8, 10 years before.
That's predicted by prior psychopathology, though, really, right?
In most cases, yeah.
So can I ask one more question? Is everybody going to hate me? If it's really quick, I'll make it quick. Okay. Because we're running a study, and I think it speaks to the slide that you had about positive coping and negative religious coping. And so one concern I have is the focus in the psychology of religion in particular on what this positive negative means, and using psychopathology as a kind of way to tease this apart. So when something becomes psychopathological, right? Like most people cope with grief relatively well. George Bonanno is me at this point in clinical research. And I think what we're missing from the positive negative religious coping is actually not whether or not you attribute a supernatural agent as helpful or harmful, but the role of perceived control that you have over the event itself. You talked about depression. So Dimitri is to my right here. We just run a study on Turkey looking at the effects of the earthquake and how people cope. And we haven't published this yet. We just talked about it over drinks last night. We will. But we had, face-to-face interviews, and what we found was that people who believed in God's role, either Allah's will or Allah's punishment, so mixed, not positive and negative and mixed, had higher degrees of fatalism, meaning there's nothing we can do. This is God's will. Because they had higher degrees of fatalism, they did act in preventative behaviors, but it was prayer and ritual to pray to Allah's will. They weren't more likely to engage in things like storing water or helping people. And in turn, they had much higher levels of subjective distress through the impact of events scale and much lower levels of poorer mental health from the PHQ, right? And the only reason I say this is because I think there's much more going on, and we need much more cross-cultural research, not just on positive or negative valences of supernatural agents, but things like control and accountability. Sorry for taking up so much time, but I find it fascinating.
Well, I agree with everything that you just said.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Bryon. Thank you so much. As the son of a PhD clinical psychologist, I especially appreciated your framing of therapy as a ritualistic practice. In my case, it's been administered more informally. My dad also remarried a clinical psychologist, so he has a type as well. I was intrigued by your framing of mood variability as an adaptation, and I'm curious how you might square that with research from positive psychology, basically indicating that there's a cortical lottery for happiness, or in the sense that some people are naturally more optimistic or more pessimistic, have a more elevated mood or a lower mood, and this seems to persist over the lifespan and is largely insensitive to different events occurring with the individual in question. So it seems, this is one of the ways in which life is unfair. Some people seem naturally predisposed to be more elevated versus more depressed. And how do you think that sort of squares with variability as an adaptation?
It's a great question. This is why I frame it in terms of variability. You're absolutely right. There are differences in baseline mood. Famously, a person wins the lottery and a year later they're back at the same mood, or they become paralyzed and a year later they're back at the same mood baseline. But there is still, nevertheless, for all of those people, variability around that baseline. And what I want to propose is that variability is, when it's adaptive, is largely when it tracks environmental variability and when it doesn't exceed adaptive thresholds, adaptive limits. And part of the reason tracking environmental variability is important is because it's, for example, think about it in ancestral terms. In high latitudes or very low latitudes, there aren't a lot of calories out there in the winter. It pays to have low mood during the winter, what we call seasonal affective disorder. And I think the same thing is true in modern environments, but we pathologize it in a way that I don't think, that doesn't mean we shouldn't treat it. I think we should treat it. I just don't think we should pathologize it.
I just wanted to say, variability, genetic variability among baselines could also be seen as adaptive from a species perspective, based on what you were saying.
You mean from you're talking about a group selection perspective?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I have all kinds of crazy crackpot theories about group selection that we could go into. It pays to have conservatives and liberals. It pays to have cooperators and competitors because they are adaptive under different conditions. Yeah.
So if depression is, in some sense, at least for a period of time, an adaptive response to environmental variability, why does it always feel so crappy? Right? When sleeping is an environment, an adaptive response to variations in yourself and environment, and it feels good, right? So if this depression is something like, a form of hibernation, why does it feel the way it does? Why does it not feel like, oh, good, I'm responding correctly?
Well, it doesn't always feel painful. So not everyone who's depressed is dysphoric. These are prototypes. The depression is a prototype that I presented, and elevated mood is a prototype. But a lot of people who are depressed are not dysphoric. That said, I'll address your question about dysphoria. It's for the same reason that pain hurts. It's because that will create the associative learning. Now, there's a philosophical question there of why aren't we just zombies with the same responses? You'll have to ask David Chalmers that one. I don't have the answer to that.
I will. I'll raise this for him.
Thank you. I was just curious about the mismatch between facial expressions and an emotion. Of course, there's an interrelationship between facial expression and an emotion, but in a way, how one presents an expression, for example, of elevated mood or low mood, we know that obviously periods of atonia can also during depression can also manifest as flatter effects. But in your framework, what's the adaptive relevance of facial expression? Is it a representation, a token towards others to represent one's emotive state? Is it to serve a social function in your opinion?
Yeah, I can't say I have a highly informed opinion about that. I do believe what has been suggested by people like Ekman, and also John Bowlby and others, that there's a signaling function. In social animals, it pays off to have a fear expression, because it's a silent signal that you should attend to a perceived threat. Whether there are functions beyond that, probably people in the room know the answer to that question, but I don't.